growing up, I would say anywhere between 10, maybe 14, maybe. I would spend time with my nieces and my nephews, mostly my nieces, and we would make promises to one another. The famous, the strong, the ever-enduring pinky promise. The pinky promise was the thing to do when you wanted to confirm that you were being honest and what you're saying was true beyond a doubt. You'd say, I pinky promise I did that. Or they would say, well, did you do this? Well, I pinky promise. Do you pinky promise? It's like you got to put it down there if it's certain. But then there was the clause. This hidden thing that would happen when somebody would walk behind you, you got your fingers crossed. So when they expect you to do it, they were like, hey, you didn't do that like you promised. Well, I had my fingers crossed, you didn't see it. That takes away the promise if you had your fingers crossed. And when we look into the book of James, we go to chapter 5, starting in verse 12, we have God, through James, telling us about swearing. Swearing, promising, but not of any strange type of swearing, but more the kind in which you have an oath. It says in James chapter 5, verse 12, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. So, we don't swear. Why? I think the first reason that we can just look at from the book of James is that we're to be doers of the word. It's very apparent. We go back to James chapter 1, verse 18. If you want to turn with me, you may. We'll refresh our memories on that. I think I did it again. We'll go back to it's a different reference, but verse 22. It says, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers, deluding yourselves. Okay, so drawing that back to chapter 5, what do we conclude? Well, this is the word. He says don't do it, so we don't do it. But is there more? Of course there's more. Secondly, if we swear with an oath, we will fall under judgment. Well, again, it kind of goes back to what is that judgment? Why are we judged? Because we're judged because he said don't do it, and he is the judge, so he has that authority. There's one judge, one lawgiver, and he gave the law, and so he's going to judge us. But is there more? There is more. There's more because we have to see where this came from, where this declaration, where this command came from. When we swear with an oath, it will cause people to sin by thinking they are not under a binding obligation. Now, I'm using these words particularly because we have to go back in time, looking at the passage in the Old Testament text. So the references that we're going to be covering today, this is a little bit more of a informational sermon than a preaching sermon. But let's go to Numbers chapter 30. And I'll try to walk you through this in a straight line. And if I don't do that. This line becomes crooked. I'll have this sermon and this explanation particularly available to you in writing, where I've written all this out as reasonably as I can. That'll be available on the Workplace. So, Numbers chapter 30. We won't read the whole passage. We're really going to focus in on verse 2. But feel free to read it when you have time. Okay, I'm starting 30, verse 1. Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the sons of Israel, saying, "This is the word which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation," I'm using the New American Standard, 1995, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Okay, so that's the standard by which God is going to be, or Jesus is going to be judging, who is God, the next few people we're going to be looking at here. So it begins there. So there's this obligation. You have to make a vow toward God. And if you have any obligations, you must do what you said you're going to do. Right? So let's look at Matthew now. Matthew chapter 23. Because this is going to help us to understand how we have the James passage. And I'm going to build you up to that. Matthew chapter 23, verse 16 through 22. So, here we have Jesus speaking to the scribes and to the Pharisees, and he gives a number of woes as to what they're doing. And he says in verse 16, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated.' You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold?" So let me pause here for a moment so it'll be easier to follow through, I think. Notice what just happened. Notice what just happened. The Pharisees are saying, okay, if you make this swear, which I'm going to give you a little bit of insight. You're going to have to go back and look this up. But that word for swear here is the exact same Greek word as oath in James. They just translated it a little bit different. Okay? So whoever swears or makes an oath, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple he's obligated. So what they are doing is trying to say, okay, if you do this, then you have to do it. But if you do this, you don't have to do it. And all of these things, we'll get to this, but I'm going to say it up front. All of these things are here on earth, right? The temple, the gold, all of it's here on earth. So keep that in mind. But God says, you fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? Let's keep going on. And whoever swears by, verse 18, whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on the altar is obligated. They did the same thing again. They're saying this is nothing and this is something. And all this is on earth. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the altering? The offering. So what is Jesus doing here? He's trying to point them to the significant thing. He's trying to say, look, yes, you're saying that this doesn't matter, but truly it does. And we'll see that here. Because whatever is in the temple is sanctified because of the temple. Whatever's on the altar is sanctified because of the altar. So they're still significant. You can't just say this doesn't matter and this does matter. They both matter. And he's going to go on to build with this in verse 20. He's going to explain it better than I. Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears by both the altar and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by both the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. There's a bit of a connection here. I had to draw a picture in order to really see this. And so I'm going to try to do this with my fingers here in the air. So you have the temple, right? You have the temple, and then you have the gold that sits in the temple, and then you have the altar which sits in the temple, and the offering which is in the temple, and then God is in the temple. And God, out of all those, is the greatest thing, right? He's in it. If we look back in the Old Testament, it shows that he was dwelling in the temple, and he is greater than all those things. And there's another important point. He's in connection with all those things. And so, therefore, when you are giving an oath or a promise to any of those, because he's in connection with that, you're giving it to God, because he's in connection with that. And we're going to come to see here in a moment that he's also in connection with the earth and heaven. And so truly, you are giving an oath to God. It's an oath to God. And let's look at the next example here. Matthew chapter 5, verse 30. Matthew chapter 5, verse 30 through 36. This is the passage known as the Sermon on the Mount. Give me one moment. I don't know why. I think I did it again. I have a wrong reference. Okay. Go down to 33. Yes, chapter 5, 33. Chapter 5, verse 33. It says, "Again you have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.'" Hopefully that draws your mind back to Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, in that passage there. "But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king." And this should also draw your mind back to James, but we'll get to that in a little bit. "Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is evil." So, he is showing here that there's a connection between what is on earth and God. He's saying, don't make an oath by heaven, because it's the throne of God. So there's a connection. Not earth, because it's his footstool. Not your own head, because we're on earth. And I mean, we can look at other passages as well that show that we are his possession, but we are also on earth, and we don't need to make it by our own head. And all that needs to happen is yes, yes, or no, no. Now, let me explain the yes really quickly. What is a yes? A yes is affirming. You can go to court, right? Put your hand up, and some people don't want to make an oath. And that's fine. And I think that's proper. And so what do? They tell you to affirm. I affirm that I am telling the truth. Is that okay? I submit to you, yes. It's okay. Because you're just saying, I am telling the truth. You can even say, I promise I'm telling the truth. There's no oath attached to it. There's nothing that you're using to confirm the authenticity or the truth of what you're saying. I promise to tell you the truth. Leave it at that. Because what we'll find coming up is the only things that we are allowed to affirm. Well, let me say it a different way. We're allowed to use our own word. That's it. If we say this is the case, if it's yes, it's yes. If it's no, it's no. I promise, I affirm, that's it. Because truly, all of it leads back to God. And it says here, verse 37, anything beyond this is evil. But why is it evil? How is it evil, rather? Let's go back to the last passage. You remember how the Pharisees and scribes were called blind men, blind guides, and fools? Is because when they tried to make these oaths that were put on things of the earth, and then they were not obligating people to it. You're like, oh, you don't have to do that, but you have to do that. You don't have to do that, but you're doing that. You don't have to do that. No. It's all God's. It all goes back to God. It's all His. And so God is not wanting them with the oath to confirm anything to be led astray like them. That's why He says anything beyond this is evil. It's all going back to God. Everything goes back to God. So He just says, just affirm it. Just say yes and no. That's it. Don't go anywhere else. Okay. So this may also draw your minds to something else. Turn with me to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 6. Verse 16. All right, this one's right. Okay, verse 16 and following. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of His purpose, interposed, so that's put between, with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, that's the swear and the oath, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. God just gave an oath. Does that make what God did evil? Some of you may think, well, there's things that God can do that we can't do, and so that's the end of the matter. And that's true. You know, vengeance is mine, said the Lord. We're not allowed to take vengeance on people, but God will take vengeance. Does this fit into that? Well, I want to show you something. Notice Genesis chapter 22, verse 16. And this is where He gave that initial oath and He swore. Genesis chapter 22, verse 16. 22, verse 16. Genesis chapter 22, verse 16. It says, and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. So this is the account of Abraham who went to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he was getting ready to do it, and God called on him. He says, here I am, and he didn't end up killing his son. and there was a ram, I think, that was caught. And so God spoke this to him after that. But notice where it says, by myself I have sworn. When I read this initially, I used to think, oh, okay, he's the one who swore. I get it. And kind of go over it. But when you take this in light of the how people swear and knowing that it was an oath, this was part of the oath, you can see it differently. He says, by myself. You can put, by heaven I have sworn. By earth I have sworn. For now put, by myself. Because he is one of the unchangeable things. So the oath was himself. And the swear was the latter part of it, which says, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing, you have not withheld your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. Verse 17, greatly bless you. And that's the promise. That's the swear. And so how does it fit in that he himself is the oath and it still isn't a sin? Well, remember what we discussed before, leading up with the other verses in Matthew, and how God was having, he wants them to focus on him because it's all in connection to him, right? The temple, the gold, the altar, it's him. The earth is his. Heaven is his throne. It's all about him, all about God. And so then we're all obligated to him. Every promise that comes out of our mouth, you say this, it's an obligation to God. If you say you didn't do this, it's an obligation to God. It all leads back to God. And so he did it with himself, to God. That's why it's not evil for God to do it, because he did it for himself. He did the oath as himself. So let's conclude with a summarizing thought. This lesson was shorter than usual for, I think, good reason. There's a number of passages that I went to, a number of contexts in which I hopped into, and I want you guys to have the time to be able to go back and examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good, see what you think about this, and try to put the pieces together for yourself. So I didn't want to overwhelm with the thoughts. But again, if you were hoping to look more at how I charted this path, I have it written out and I'll put it on Workplace for anybody that's interested. But a summarizing thought. Your words are a binding obligation to God. Your words are a binding obligation to God. You say you're going to do this, you promise, you affirm, you confirm, it's to God. You don't need to make anything else out of that. You don't need to say, I swear on my mother's grave. I swear to... That's it. That's all you need to do. And so I hope that this helps you to be built up in recognizing that your words are important. What you say is important. You can't just say something and not expect God to bind you to what you're saying. Because everything that we do in the Christian walk, and even if you're not a Christian, you're accountable to God. So then when we make a promise, when we say yes about something, when we affirm or confirm something, know that we are obligated to God. We're not obligated to any physical thing. You can't just say this doesn't matter and that doesn't matter. It all matters because it matters to God. Please think on these things, meditate on these things, and pray as we sing. Our
Our invitation song and song to prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper will be the same, one and the same, song 350. Now, I like this song. I've never led this song, so bear with me. I have a lot of smiles looking at me now. That's awesome. Just don't throw things at me when we're done. We gather here in Jesus' name. His love is burning in our hearts like living flame. For through the loving Son, the Father makes us one. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. No one is a stranger here. Everyone belongs. Finding our forgiveness here, we in turn forgive all wrongs. He joins us here, he breaks the bread. The Lord who pours the cup is risen from the dead. The one we love the most is now our gracious host. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. We are now a family of which the Lord is head. Though unseen, he makes us hear in the breaking of the bread. We'll gather soon where angels sing. We'll see the glory of our Lord and coming King. Now we anticipate the feast for which we wait. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord.
It is such a blessing to be a disciple of Christ, to be a son and a daughter of God, our Father, to recognize and glorify our Master, to worship Him, to humble our hearts, and to be here with one another, knowing